Hi, it's Josh. I am back again with the latest edition of the Josh Bloom Podcast. This is episode number 61. Do you know that this podcast is listed in podcast players as simply Josh Bloom? Not the Josh Bloom Podcast. I did that on purpose to stand out. I figure there are a million podcasts that are the so-and-so podcast, and this way I am just Josh Bloom being Josh Bloom, and you can feel like we are visiting rather than me presenting you with a show. This is also why this podcast is somewhat infrequent, because you don't visit with your friend every day or every week or every month or even every year in some cases. But if you do want to hear from me more often, you can always follow my other podcast, 1,461 Days of Ignoring with Josh Bloom, which is political in nature, but filled with tangents nonetheless. I hope that podcast will end at the time we should expect it to end, but for now, it will continue for some time and be released somewhat weekly. Look for a link in the show notes. One of the reasons the Josh Bloom podcast takes longer to produce is because I base it on extended essays I write, which can stretch to many thousands of words. Case in point, today's episode titled, I Am Sick of Talking About Paul McCartney, which is based on my 6,500-word piece, similarly titled, I Am Sick of Writing About Paul McCartney, which is available to read right now on my Substack. Substack is the platform where all of my long-form writing lives, including the illustrated posts that accompany this podcast. If you are unfamiliar, Substack is a platform where writers publish writing, which is then emailed as a newsletter to subscribers like you, so you have something to read when you really want to read something. If you are interested in immersing yourself in the artifacts I mention in today's show, Substack is where you want to go. So, when you hear me say, subscribe to my Substack, that means go to superjews.substack.com, that's superjews.substack.com, and just enter your email address. If you want to be extra kind, you can also choose a payment option. Look for a link in the show notes. There is a piece of information that is not in the essay, but is alluded to in the thumbnail image that goes with this edition of the show. I already sent it out to my Substack subscribers when I announced this episode, but you can also see it by looking it up on my YouTube channel. There is an anomaly in the image that I thought would be fun to mention. It provides a small insight into the editing process of the essay that this episode originates from. The thumbnail image contains a cutout of the late Fleetwood Mac singer and songwriter Christine McVie. Christine is not mentioned in the essay or this show. I mean, except for now, but she was when I was designing the thumbnail image. In an effort to tighten up a segment of the story, I had to take out the passage where I brought up Christine. Lucky for you, here is that passage now, completely out of context. This was confirmed when I posted about David's Tap Meets Wings observation access on Threads. This user's reply lodged this image in my mind forever. One of my favorite background grace notes is Janine on stage with a tambourine, rocking her best Christine McVie fit during Jazz Odyssey. It's super Linda-coded. Yes, Christine McVie, another pantsuit-wearing icon of the 70s, has entered the piece. Hey, I'm back. Now, there is no way you have any idea what any of that meant, but you will soon as we get into this week's episode. So, without further delay, I want to say I am sick of talking about Paul McCartney. Please enjoy me talking about Paul McCartney. I will be back afterwards. I am sick of writing about Paul McCartney. The new Paul projects Man on the Run and The Boys of Dungeon Lane bring out my empathy and my pith for Paul. The way I deal with Paul McCartney can be summed up by the following two posts I made on successive days. Sensitive. If you have an 84-year-old singing voice, use it to sing a song such as Days We Left Behind, which simply can't be sung without the wisdom of age that we hear here. Beautiful. Insensitive. I love the new single Days We Left Behind and the entire intimate nostalgia concept of Paul McCartney's new album, The Boys of Dungeon Lane. But if he really wants to take me back, he'll write and record the next one while completely obliterated on Prellies. My two takes on Paul's new work reflect my own character flaws. I am working on not always reverting to funny when I am confronted by my feelings. For now, I have deeply empathetic thoughts about Paul, and consequently, I have superficial, pithy thoughts about Paul. Paul McCartney is one of the most, if not the most, enduring and studied people in pop culture, and as I learn more about myself, I enjoy using whatever Paul is presenting to the public or trying to hide about his past and present as a real-time compare and contrast. I wasn't going to watch the new Paul McCartney Man on the Run, even though Amazon Prime is one of the last vestiges of the life I led when I had a steady income. I now qualify for some kind of Amazon hardship stipend that supports my artist's life, until my friend David said he had seen it, loved it, and asked if I had watched it. I thought that it might be a fun topic to explore at 10 a.m.ish Eastern, 8 a.m.ish Mountain. This is the window on weekdays when David is commuting to work. There is a small but substantial enough amount of time for us to catch up before the Rocky Mountains block David's cell phone signal. I suggested this and he replied, "Of course, we can totally nerd out." I guess this means I have to watch the film now. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind. It was my suggestion after all. I just had a feeling that I would end up exactly where I am now. These days, as a writer, I can't bring myself to experience much of anything at all without thinking about it in a writerly way, and by that I mean I feel like I am supposed to write about it. I knew that I wouldn't be able to just watch the film. I would be compelled to take notes. I tried not to. I told myself, Josh, just enjoy watching a movie. Then, well, I'll write down a few thoughts. Then a few thoughts became more than 1,000 words of thoughts. I reasoned, well, these are only notes for my conversation with David. Then I realized that I would likely end up taking notes during our conversation as well. I did. In all honesty, I welcome this diversion. I call it Paul-crastinating. I have been working for the better part of a year on a much longer essay, and now I can step away from one piece of work to pay attention to another. I am sick of writing about Paul McCartney. Please enjoy my writing about Paul McCartney. It kind of boils down to seeing more pictures of Paul with a beard, was David's response when I asked why he loved the film. I get it. This is probably the reason Paul loved the film too. We never see old Paul on screen. We only hear him. What we do see is Paul in his post-Beatles prime, early to mid-1970s, variously depressed as a man and re-emerging as a musician, two representations of the character traits that inspire my empathy and pith for Paul. Paul was perceived as a villain at the end of the Beatles. The Let It Be film and press surrounding that moment in the band's history tended to frame him as bossy. I believe the counter-narrative that I am sure Paul would like me to believe. He was just trying to keep the band together. I don't think this is untrue. As I was contemplating this idea, I heard a similar take on the topic delivered in a signature bombastic style. Penn Jillette of the legendary magic duo Penn and Teller saw the Paul doc and commented on his podcast about it, contrasting the rebellious energy of mid-1960s John Lennon with Paul's late 60s efforts to keep the band's work on track. "What the fuck are you?" Penn offers as a suggestion of the tone at the time. "Are you some high school principal of the Beatles?" Then, "The most disparaging thing you can say about Paul is that he was the boss. This is the definition of growing up. Going from John Lennon to Paul McCartney." I recently wrapped up listening to the 40-plus hours of Beatles historian Mark Lewison's insanely detailed Tune-In biography, which traces every nuance of Beatles lore from the birth of the band members and the band members who did not remain band members, all the way through to the end of 1962 as the Beatles were beginning to become famous in the UK. This listen required much more of a commitment from me than Penn's podcast did. While the book is unassailable as far as factual information, it is, of course, subject to Lewison's personal biases as much as any book that interprets history is going to be. This look into the early personalities of the band members helped me understand Paul's behavior after Beatles manager Brian Epstein unexpectedly died during the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band era, leaving the boys without a clear career direction and, more troubling, without sound financial and business advice. Paul announced his first solo album, McCartney, in April 1970 with a Q&A that some say contained the first public announcement that the band was no longer. Q. Is your break with the Beatles temporary or permanent due to personal differences or musical ones? A. Personal differences, business differences, musical differences, but most of all because I have a better time with my family. In a 1982 interview with the NME, Paul countered this narrative by reminding us that he didn't write these questions. He didn't. He only answered them. He did. I had talked to Peter Brown from Apple and asked him what we were going to do about press on the McCartney album. He said, I'll give you some questions, and you just write out your answers. Deflectors recognize. Either way, that press release became his first mistake, to use Paul parlance. Apparently, the competing racist and misogynistic Yoko broke up the Beatles angle had yet to take shape. Here is where I continue a personality pattern in which I take my stated stance surrounding what is clearly an emotional event and insert humor to deflect from my own feelings as a count me out, count me in kind of guy, to use John jargon. As such, you should not be surprised when, as an admirer of Yoko's work and what she has endured, I emphatically reject all Yoko slander, while sarcastically claiming for my own giddy satisfaction and safety that Yoko is solely responsible for the breakup of Wings. See? Back in reality, Paul publicly took the blame for the breakup of the Beatles. Alan Klein is a name that casual Beatles fans don't even know, much less associate with sending Paul running to the farm in the hills of Scotland that an accountant advised Paul to buy. Klein's involvement with the Beatles during their final days as a functioning foursome was another final straw. He arrived on the scene when the band was very vulnerable after the death of Brian, and he seduced John with praise, not only for John, but also for Yoko. Klein knew this manipulation would work in his favor. John, in turn, got George and Ringo on board with the idea of welcoming the New York-based businessman into the band's inner circle and into their filing cabinets, too. Ringo seemed to understand what Klein was. "At last we've got a crook on our side now," he reportedly said. Paul was not impressed. Paul always seemed skeptical of the music business. One particularly memorable story Lewison tells in Tune In is of Paul showing up late to the band's initial meeting with Brian because Paul was busy taking a bath. "At least he'll be clean," is what history has recorded as George's genius explanation of Paul's tardiness, which I interpret as a disrespectful display by Paul of boundary setting. This mix of skepticism, which later manifested itself in lawyers and litigation, continued to play out in subtle and overt ways over the last few years of the band's artistic partnership, and kept on through the 1970s and into the 1980s when Paul was a no-show at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony celebrating the Beatles. Paul claimed in a last-minute statement at the time that the still unresolved business issues within the band would serve to make him feel like a hypocrite if he appeared on stage with them. Paul's savvy at controlling perception was at play too. Even in 2026, Man on the Run continues to conveniently remind us up top that it was John Lennon who actually quit the Beatles first, although John did not hastily issue a confusing and coy Q&A to the press about it. Back in 1988, Paul was likely thinking along the lines of, why give the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the opportunity to exploit what would certainly be promoted as a Beatles reunion, regardless of John's ominous absence? I get it. In Paul's voice, why should we get back to where we once belonged for you, when we can get back to where we once belonged for us? Again, I can't help injecting humor into pathos. Those unresolved business issues trace back to the divide created by Alan Klein. Klein did secure better business deals for the Beatles, and he even conceived of the band's highly successful Red and Blue compilation albums, which for many second-generation fans like me were the entry point to the band. I loved peering through the translucent blue vinyl when I was 5 years old, but today I feel like I should have been shaking my little fist while squeaking, "You are a bad man, Alan Klein." Paul was outvoted when it came to Klein managing the Beatles, but he refused to allow Klein to become his personal manager, and Klein used the divide to conquer. He exacerbated the discord between Paul and John, going as far as to suggest the famously insulting lyric, "The only thing you done was yesterday," for John's song How Do You Sleep from Imagine. Brian Epstein would never do something so classless and so crass. The reality is these two best friends were falling apart, which unfortunately is what often happens. My friend David and I split up for a period of years before realizing that nerding out was more important, and we didn't even have the pressure of growing up in the biggest band in the world together. Paul and John knew what it was like to feel abandoned, both having lost their mothers young. Now, Paul found himself heartbroken, angry, and without the creative partner who was his brother before fame. They grew up as teens in trouble. But John was always in more trouble, always in more trauma, and did not live long enough to fully resolve it all. In an interview with Man on the Run director Morgan Neville, Paul says that after Klein was out of the picture, he finally started speaking with John regularly again. I would ring him up, Paul says. I'd started making bread, and John said, "Oh yeah, I'm making bread." Paul found it peaceful that he and John now had ordinary domesticity in common. It was all getting much nicer. This peace was Paul's only consolation when John was killed. Thank God we got it back together. I don't know what I would have thought if we hadn't. Maybe if they had managed to fully reconnect from their shared perspective as evolved adults sooner, John wouldn't have been living in New York in 1980 at all. When I say I have deeply empathetic thoughts about Paul, I refer you to another Paul piece I wrote. This one, bluntly titled, "Has Your Best Friend Ever Been Murdered?" is about what it must have been like for Paul to live through the murder of his best friend. That explains the title. See, I did it again. I wrote Has Your Best Friend Ever Been Murdered in 2024, not long after the release of Now and Then, a decent track marketed into a corner with the phrase, "the final Beatles song." Paul was once again being criticized for messing with the band's legacy unnecessarily. I didn't then, and I don't think now, that people realize how the lads didn't know much about life at the time of the breakup of the Beatles. When it ended, Paul was only 27 years old. He joined John's band The Quarrymen when he was only 16. He brought his friend George Harrison along when George was only 15. They only knew themselves as the Beatles from that point on. Watching it made me want to make art, David said to me as we continued our discussion of Man on the Run. David is an artist himself. See his whimsical and thematic post-it note Sharpie sketches on Instagram. A link is in the show notes. He speaks about inspiration from a place that is different from someone who doesn't make art. David's reaction makes sense to me when I think back on when we first see Paul in the film. He is depicted as lost at the outset of Man on the Run, struggling to pull himself together and survive psychologically and emotionally. Take away the money and the fame and consider the man who only knew himself as part of this monolith that was built around him. We hear a voiceover of Paul saying that he doesn't know if he'll ever write another note of music again. I found out from the Lewison book that Paul and John, two titans of songwriting, didn't actually write songs together in earnest until they were already several years into performing as the Beatles. In late 1962, when Paul and John kicked into compositional overdrive, it was not typical for bands to write their own material. Without the pressure of a recording contract, Paul and John might have carried on at a much more lackadaisical pace, if at all. Songwriting was not a dedicated passion until it had to be. But only 7 or 8 years later, it is actually plausible to think that Paul might decide to leave this portion of his life behind and chalk it up to a lark. His depression is not a surprise under these circumstances. However, while I sound as cynical as intended when I say this, and I say this a lot, it strikes me as almost laughable when I hear talk of submitting to seclusion, getting back to nature, and living a quiet, small life away from it all when it comes from the mouth of a rich and famous set-for-life multimillionaire. Empathy and pith for Paul. Even the motion art collage montages and lo-fi folksy feeling editing techniques used throughout Man on the Run visually represent the ironic contradiction of Paul's retreat to a remote dump of a home built atop a mountain of cash. They are meant to feel like the Paul with a beard that David pointed out, but with a beard maintained by a very expensive beard stylist using the finest of expensive beard oils, who snacks on artisanal bean-to-bar chocolate after having arrived famished at the beard styling studio on their restored vintage fixed-gear bicycle. While this comes off as sort of try-hard to a critic, I don't mind it as a viewer because part of Paul is authentically Paul with a beard to me. It's the part of Paul that John Lennon sometimes criticized as the writer of granny music. I understand the idea behind John's insult, but I also appreciate Paul's penchant for sincere sentimentality, and since I am about to discuss the dead, like as in actually deceased, not the band, I don't mind defending Paul for a second by taking John to task. John Lennon's contradictions are too many to mention, but one worth touching on specifically here is his own diversions into sentimentality, especially during his solo years. When this comes up during my discussion of the Paul film with David, I suggest the double fantasy trifecta of dad songs, just like Starting Over, Watching the Wheels, and Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy as evidence. Surprisingly, David doesn't agree that these examples are the most egregious. Maybe he was thinking of Woman, also from Double Fantasy? Damn, John was touching on great granny territory on that record, quite frankly. While I am trotting on John's grave, I might as well go again. The love of Paul's life, Linda Eastman, who, if she weren't white, might have very well been blamed for breaking up the Beatles instead of Yoko, deserves no mull of kintyre from me. Allow me to make amends for that truly trying pun by stating that Paul's Mull of Kintyre is still the biggest selling single in UK history that wasn't specifically made to benefit a charity. Linda did nothing wrong in my estimation, but if her lawyer father hadn't gone into battle with Alan Klein in a Paul versus John, George, and Ringo winner-take-all-you-need-is-love battle, the Beatles may not have disbanded. Penn Jillette made a passing mention of this during his tirade about the Paul doc. Note, it wasn't really a tirade, but if you've ever spent time listening to Penn, everything starts to sound like a tirade. Penn. If you're in a tight business relationship with someone who is a junkie, referring to John, the chances of lawyers being in your life become greater. As alluded to in my previous Paul piece, Has Your Best Friend Ever Been Murdered? I don't condone the public proclaiming that they know the way John should be mourned by Paul, and the same goes for how Paul remembers and reveres Linda, not now, and not when she was alive. Paul clearly stated his feelings on track 1 of his first solo album. She is the lovely Linda. Paul invited Linda to join his post-Beatles band Wings for reasons a composer of sentimental granny music would. He wanted to spend time with her. John and Yoko spent time in a bag. Paul and Linda toured the world and spent time with jet lag. As a singer, Linda made a damn good photographer, but her voice was unique, and Paul welcomed her to contribute to the sound of Wings. He took a similar chance just because he wanted to with guitarist Jimmy McCulloch, who was a member of Wings from 1974 to 1977. Young Jimmy, he joined Wings barely out of his teens off of an already established career as a session guitarist, was Paul's pick to do the picking. A big opportunity and responsibility for a newly minted 20-something compared to the seasoned legend that was 32-year-old Paul McCartney. David and I both noticed that Paul's voiceover in Man on the Run regarding Jimmy's untimely death from drugs came off as matter-of-fact, bordering on callous. I didn't make a specific note about Paul's exact wording on the matter, so when I started to search for it, the results I found included others that also mentioned Paul's whatever tone about this tragedy. He was always a little dangerous, Paul says of Jimmy. In the end, he was just too dangerous for his own good. Even without the tone, reading this back now sounds cold, performative, and generic. Further research places the quote as recorded close to the time of the film's production, and this fact, like the dichotomy of my 2 days of Paul posts on social media, conjures a couple of thoughts. 1. Mr. Sincere Sentimentality is Mr. Sincere Sentimentality when his coin is flipped to that side. Speaking of flip, Mr. Sincere Sentimentality can be just that when his coin lands on tails. Dismissive and insensitive. I had never heard of Jimmy McCulloch before watching this film, but I don't like the way Paul speaks about him. 2. Considering that this voiceover was recorded recently, I immediately realized that this is the recollection of a man who has suffered great loss. I am self-promoting with context again, but I must point back to my earlier article in which I wonder about how a person deals on a daily basis with the reality that their best friend was viciously murdered. I don't discuss Linda in my earlier article about Paul's losses, but I could have done so in a similar way. John and Linda played such outsized roles in creating and sustaining the public person we know as Paul McCartney, and they did this for the private man too. Paul tells Morgan Neville that Linda taught him how not to be uptight. He continues, in a situation like that, when you've lost your job, you can get very uptight. If losing the Beatles, which Paul minimizes as losing his job, sent him into an identity spiral, imagine, I have been avoiding that word, but I have run out of patience with myself, what the loss of these key people in Paul's life must have done to rattle the Blackbird writer's cage. It's with this in mind that I give Paul a little bit of grace in how he speaks about the untimely death of anyone close to him, even if Jimmy McCulloch was only his Wings bandmate for a few years. I suppose, to paraphrase Paul's own words twice, and in the end, the danger you take is equal to the danger you make. Here I go again. Another band that has suffered loss is Spinal Tap. I was surprised to hear my favorite fictional band, I give the Ruddles some attention momentarily, brought up in Man on the Run in reference to the rotating Wings lineup. David made an observation that I can't unsee. He pointed out that Paul reminded him of Tap's David St. Hubbins, with Linda being his girlfriend and emergency Tap manager, Janine. This isn't about Paul and Linda literally looking like David and Janine. They do. The intentionality behind their hairstyles and Linda's casual 70s stoner vibes permanently divert attention from a history of mop top and summer of love mockery. Paul actually appears in the recent This Is Spinal Tap sequel, which I will not watch in order to protect my reverence for the original. This reveal was confusing to me since Paul was apparently peeved about the Ruddles film in 1978, and based on the following, still is. He is fine with parody as long as he is not the one being parodied. The hilarious Ruddles show, All You Need Is Cash, skewering the Beatles, was made by George Harrison's Monty Python buddy Eric Idle and cuts close to the bone. When Man on the Run lumps it in as a weird film project with the resoundingly rejected Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band film starring Peter Frampton, also released in 1978, it seems like an intentional slight and another example of Paul protecting himself by controlling the narrative. I identify with that and can't overlook the irony that the source of the potential hurt is comedy. As I continued watching Wings era tour footage, Linda caught me off guard when I saw her strut off the stage after a successful set, exclaiming, "All right, all right, all right." If you are hearing the iconic catchphrase of Mr. Matthew McConaughey in your head, you should. Linda's usage of it is so compelling, I had to investigate. Indeed, young Matthew was 6 years old when Wings performed in Houston on May 4th, 1976, a mere 4 hours from his home in Uvalde, Texas. The perfect age to be subconsciously impressed for life by Linda's backstage banter. I will let this mystery go for now. Again, Linda's record is seemingly spotless when it comes to meddlers of record residing in Beatles lore. On a 1 to 10 scale of Beatles breakup villains, I rate Alan Klein an 8.2 and Linda a 0.8. But I am lying if my mind isn't continuing to question her complete lack of culpability in the breakup of the band, especially when I feel compelled to defend and deflect on behalf of Yoko. 0.8 ain't nothing. But that's enough of that. To parody a well-known Paul pronouncement, "It's the bloody Beatles breakup, get over it." I will, but I am going to continue to enjoy fictionalizing this comparison on my own time. You can too. If you have access to vintage Prellies or some of Paul's favorite dynamite weed, visions of hairstyles will begin to dance in your head. Just don't do it if you plan on entering Japan like the man on the run. Speaking of a man on the run entering Japan with no plan, the film explores Paul's foolhardy decision or oblivious indecision to try and get through customs at New Tokyo International Airport on January 16, 1980, with almost a half-pound of marijuana in his luggage. For those who don't deal in those quantities, Paul was traveling with about 200 dime bags. That's not dynamite, that's dynamite. Paul was a user, not a dealer, so I begin riffing with David about what the hell Paul might have been thinking. Like, how and where did he think he would be able to consume his weed in Japan? Did he expect to find it backstage while checking his rider requirements? Vegetable curry. Check. Tea with free-range bee honey. Check. Vegetarian water. Check. Half-pound of dynamite weed. Some say that Paul was covering for Linda, who accidentally left the bag in her baggage. If that ridiculous mistake made by people of pronounced privilege isn't the explanation, then are we supposed to believe Paul said to himself, "Yeah, man, put it in my suitcase. I don't even need to hide it under me folded trousers. They'll just say, oh wow, that's Paul McCartney's weed. How cool." Some serious nutters have even speculated that John and Yoko called customs on Paul. I love that conspiracy theory in particular. I hear paranoid Paul in my head saying, "John hired you, Knox, didn't he? No one is allowed to be known for bags but him and his old lady, is that it? Bloody hell." Some speculate that Paul composed most of McCartney 2 during his 9-day Japanese jail stay. In actuality, most of that album was finished prior to the forced cancellation of the Wings tour of Japan, but the experience did inform Paul's decision to push forward as a solo artist and less as a member of Wings. Still, it would have been cool if he had taken the opportunity to rewrite one of his most popular Wings songs in optimistic Paul fashion, sung to the tune of Let 'Em In. Someone knocking at me luggage, someone is jingling the keys, someone opened up me luggage, I hope the bloke finds what he needs. Do me a favor, open my bag and see my weed. Oh yeah, see my weed. While I am in weird Josh Blumkovic mode, let's move away from Paul's bag and back to John and Yoko's. In honor of the reportage style of the song, I have added a 6th verse to the final #1 single by the Beatles. Here is my contribution to what I now call the Ballad of John and Yoko and Josh, sung to the tune of verse 3 of the Ballad of John and Yoko. Toasting up a breakfast of muffins, muffins that are English like John. I thought a steamed pork bun was only Chinese, but Japanese call a baoe nukoman. Good. I got that out of my system. I needed to make some light, as both the film and this piece turn dark. I couldn't watch the last 7 minutes of the show. There was history that was going to be difficult to see and hear. There was also history that I didn't know about yet that was also going to be difficult to see and hear too. This is ridiculous given what is to come, but I didn't need to know what Bruce McMouse is. Paul didn't realize that when people think of Mick, they think of McDonald's, or that when people think of an animated mouse, they think of Mickey. Beyond that clearly smoke-fueled oversight, what in holy hell could have possessed Paul to green light a story about a family of mice living beneath the Wings concert stage? I made some really mad decisions, Paul says to Morgan Neville. I think it was just the attitude of the times. Paul then quickly adds in a flash of self-awareness, followed by deflection that reminds me of the interview from 1982 about Paul's controversial Q&A from 1970. I'm blaming the times. I'm not blaming me. Paul shelved this ill-conceived film featuring Bruce McMouse for years, but eventually let the rodents loose in 2019. It comes down to defending a decades-old decision versus continuing to be criticized for keeping it closeted. If John had a say, Bruce McMouse would still be in a trap today. John and Paul both produced great solo work and certifiable solo clunkers, but when they worked together, they stoked each other's strengths and doused each other's weaknesses. I was reminded of my "Has your best friend ever been murdered?" piece when we hear Paul explain in Man on the Run that John had a way of bringing Paul back around to their core friendship anytime they would get into a heated argument. "It's only me," John would say while removing his iconic glasses. John didn't like to wear them at the time when he and Paul first became friends. Now, taking them off reminded Paul of young John, his friend, not John Lennon, his famous friend. "One of my best friends was killed in gun violence right around here, so it's important to me," Paul said when he was interviewed in 2018 in New York City while attending a March for Our Lives rally in support of gun control measures. Paul doesn't name the friend. He knows who he's talking about, and it doesn't matter to him if we do, but we do. Paul's friend John, not our friend John Lennon. The difference for me is the difference between tears and none. Recently, I discovered a clip of a Paul appearance on a BBC show called Desert Island Discs. This was filmed not much more than a year after John's murder. Paul wraps up the show by spinning Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy from Double Fantasy, the last album John released in his lifetime. I mentioned the song earlier as part of my discussion with David about John's own penchant for sentimentality in the face of his criticisms of Paul for the same. I am warning you with peace and love, to use Ringo rhetoric. This clip is hard to watch. It is very painful to see Paul trying so hard to hide his raw emotions as he listens to John sing about the son he will not see grow past the age of 5. I want to share this clip with David because he lost a son. I feel like he would connect with Paul's emotions here in a way that I can't. For the first time, I feel no inclination to shield myself with humor. I don't even know how. I am hopeful that this is a sign of seeing myself grow up. I have never been able to discuss David's loss with him in detail, but I hope he knows that I am here if he ever needs to. I have no feelings of personal loss as deep as David's to access that would allow me to be fully present if that moment comes. I watched my mother die over the course of years from cancer, and my father and I didn't even know each other when he went, but there is a memory relevant to this story that endures. I said before that I couldn't watch the rest of Man on the Run. I looked at the progress bar. 7 minutes to go. Then I looked up, and there was a familiar face from my childhood on the screen. New York News anchorman Chuck Scarborough. I was overwhelmed by a sense memory. I saw this broadcast when it first aired live in 1980. Paul didn't realize that this interview with Morgan Neville was being taped on the anniversary of John's murder. When Morgan points this out to Paul and asks how he feels, Paul replies, "The guy who did it is still in New York, and he's in jail, and he's still knocking around." This response sounds like Paul's somewhat insensitive comment about Jimmy McCulloch, especially in light of Paul being taken by surprise. I pressed pause. I did not need to remind myself of the day John Lennon was murdered. This tragedy that was felt throughout the world is still being felt by 8-year-old me and mine. This may not be where Man on the Run ends, but it is where I end. John was a hero to me. Paul was a hero to me too, but for different reasons than John. I found John visceral, uncompromising, and iconoclastic before I knew what any of those words meant. I saw his face framed in the shape of the Apple Records logo on the LP label of the Imagine album rotating on the turntable. I was hypnotized, and his songs were the soundtrack. Paul says that writing political tunes is not his style, adding, "I'm just not good at doing that." Paul's solo songs, especially those on the Wings' Greatest compilation, which in my home was heard on cassette in the car because my parents spent money instead of saving it, represented just the opposite of John's. Paul's were happy, upbeat, and fun. I knew what those words meant then, but I often do not know what they mean now. Man on the Run repeats a trope I have never understood. According to some bad actors with bad taste, Paul's second solo album, Ram, credited to Paul and Linda McCartney, was supposed to be a bad record. I never knew this. To me, Ram represents Paul's best. Too Many People, Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey, and Backseat of My Car, just to name my favorites. I sang them all to myself just now, my fingers typing in rhythm as I thought about critics who carry out personal agendas. At least I am honest about it. Days We Left Behind tells a more honest story about Paul than Man on the Run does, and in only 3% of the running time. With Days We Left Behind, Paul cannot control the narrative unless he lies. He can't mask the age of his voice. He must lean into it if he is going to use it at all. When Paul eventually sings it in a video or live, I suspect its most subtle sensitivities will give way to performance. When Paul performs the Beatles' song I've Got a Feeling in concert these days, he projects director Peter Jackson's restored Get Back documentary footage from the Apple rooftop of John's portion of the song on the screen behind him. Paul turns to face the screen to hear John sing. It is a moving moment, but also a moment when the audience is unable to see Paul's reaction and he cannot see theirs. Paul is not a liar, but he is someone who liberally harnesses the truth to his advantage. I understand what Paul tries to do. I harness the truth to my advantage too. I realize the truth is bigger than any lie can cover. If I can't beat it, I have to be it. We are left with the truth of Paul's overwhelming emotions, but he harnesses that reality to shield himself and us from the visual confirmation of his vulnerability. I am sick of writing about Paul McCartney. That's fine. It turns out that I was really writing about myself anyway. It's only me. Hi, it's Josh. I hope you enjoyed listening to that essay about Paul McCartney and me as much as I enjoyed writing it. Thanks again for listening. Please leave a rating or review for the Josh Bloom podcast in your podcast player and leave a comment saying that the show is better than 43 to 78% of shows that you have ever listened to. Please also tell a friend about the show. It is the best way to spread the word. You could say something like, "Hey, Mom, I know that I have never said that you are not only my mom, you are also my friend. I heard a podcast host named Josh Bloom suggest that a mom can also be a friend, and that got me to thinking. What did I think? I thought, I am going to tell my mom that she is also my friend. Mom, you are my friend, and as a friend, I need to recommend that you listen to the Josh Bloom podcast. If you would like to throw some support to me and the show, please subscribe to my Substack. Go to superjews.substack.com and just enter your email address. There are options to pay to subscribe to my writing there, but you can choose the free option as well. I would love to see you. A link is in the show notes. You can also buy me a coffee. For a mere $3, you will earn my undying gratitude, or at least enough gratitude to last until the next time I ask you to buy me a coffee. Go to buymeacoffee.com/Josh Bloom. Lastly, my book about psych pop icons and Elephant Six co-founding band The Apples in Stereo is available now. Choose your preferred bookseller at applesbook.com. We have reached the end of the show, but does the show ever really end? I'll see you next time.